question. How might you try to follow a scientific process in thinking about how to optimize your sleep? So I'll focus more here on how you think through making decisions, not as much on the biology of sleep and what different studies say about that. So let me start with an example. I found that I go through periods where I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm up, Middle of the night is a strong statement. Right now it's 3:45, but you know what I mean. And so I asked myself, well, what do? Do I get up? Do I go back to sleep? And sometimes I find if I'm always trying to go back to sleep, what happens is that I lie in bed and I'm like, oh, why aren't I sleeping? And I'm spending time thinking about that. And it might be actually better to just get up and get moving. Carpe diem. Or it might be better to do some activity, right? What the activities I do that help me experiment to figure out if it's likely that I'm going to get up and just begin the day, or if I might do something then come back to sleep after. Now, what are the activities we could do? What can we experiment with? What can we randomize? I think what's key here is that even though I'm a scientist, I've won $1 million prize, X prize for experimentation, I don't always remember to experiment, right? Sometimes I'm just trying to find the right answer. And that's unfortunate because, as Daniel Kahneman or Amos Tversky once said, who got the Nobel Prize in economics, we are deterministic creatures living in a probabilistic world. I'll say that again. We are deterministic creatures living in a probabilistic world. What does that mean? Well, deterministic means if A happens, then B happens with 100% probability. But that's how our brains sometimes think. I don't know if it's language, I don't know if it's how we're raised, but that's how we have a real bias. It's the structure of our minds to think that way. But here's the thing. Do we live in a deterministic world? Not really. 90x%, maybe it's 99% of cause and effect in the world is not deterministic. Maybe physics is, right? If you go over here, well, actually, that's not even true. And you push on this car, right? It moves. But that's not quite true because suppose I push it very gently. Well, yeah, it moves, but you don't even see it move, right? It moves like 1 millimeter. So if something's in physics deterministic, but let's walk through the sciences. Physics can be deterministic. Chemistry, less so. Biology, even less so. Economics, sociology, psychology, cognitive psychology, right? It gets less and less. And so here's the problem. If the world really is probabilistic, by which I mean that, well, it means many things, but here's one thing it can mean for the purposes of this conversation. If I do A, then B is cause with X% probability. So cause and effect is probabilistic, which means there's a probability of something happening. It doesn't always happen, it happens some percent of the time. And that percent of the time can be on average, but also in some contexts, right? If you push a car, it will move with certain probability. Well, that might depend on context. How strong am I? Maybe you're stronger than I am. So the 8% probability it moves when you push it, only 40% probability when I push it. Maybe it depends on the car, right? Some cars, it might be 6% chance it moves. Other cars, it's like 90%. Depends on where I push it, right? Whether I push it from the side or whether I push it from the back. And here's the kind of really interesting thing about this cause and effect. I can recommend further reading on this. There's actually a really good book called Causal Models. I think it's Philosophy and Psychology and something. It's by Alison Gopnik and Laura Schulz, one who was on my PhD committee at Berkeley. And they talk about this quite nicely in that book. Actually, or either they talked about it or someone who wrote the chapter told me about this in my PhD. But they said that one way of thinking about causality is through what these causal graphical models, also called Bayesian networks. And the idea is that when we have something like cause and effect, right? We have an average, like A is here, push, B is here, move. And so we see, well, on average, this seems to happen, let's say, 6% of the time. But that's because our variables are vague. A is very vague, right? Didn't I just if you had to think, A pushka, did you see how I just spelled out A to be more precise? Well, yeah, I said A needs to be more precise. It's not just push or not. It's like, who's pushing? What angle am I pushing from? What's the car look like? So A almost needs to be opened up and have little small variables inside of it. I think it's actually Frederick Eberhardt. Frederick, Eberhardt. You can Google him. I think he was a Caltech last time I chatted. I'm not sure where he is now, but I think he's the one who told me this, that you might think of actually unpacking that big variable A into smaller pieces, whereas the variable for like who's pushing, what kind of car, what kind of angle, and so on and so on. And so the idea is that when you see this A cause B 6% of the time, it's actually can be more precise if you unpack the variables. So that was a lot. What do you all take away from that? What would we tell someone else interesting about that? Was that unpacking where deterministic creatures are in a probabilistic world? Do you have a better understanding of what a probabilistic world is? Now let's circle back to this sleep thing, right? If I keep thinking, what is the right way to get myself to go back to sleep or get up, the right decision, I actually am using an inappropriate model, right? It's kind of like I'm putting the wrong frame onto something, right? Can you think of a good analogy where putting a probabilistic mentality onto a deterministic situation, or vice versa, putting a deterministic model onto a probabilistic situation will actually lead you astray? Well, here's one. If I assume that there's just a right answer, right, then I will tend to actually get a strategy and stick with it, right? I'll be like, okay, whenever I wake up, I just have to lie in bed till I go back to sleep. It's dark. Don't even bother to get up. Well, I might do that for many times, X times. Is X 5, 10, 50? For years. For Y years. Is Y years 1, 2, 3, 4? And I think for most of my life, actually, I did believe that you just have to lie in bed and it doesn't make sense to get up until it's before dark. And here's the problem. I was a deterministic creature thinking, oh yes, this is the thing you have to do. But I'm in a probabilistic world. If I'd experimented, I'd have figured out, actually, wait, no, you can't get up sometimes and there's value. Not you can, but there's value to doing it. And that's the thing what I figured out, if I remember, 2021, right? That actually, it might make sense to just get up and get outside even if it's dark. And so what I've been trying to do with sleep now is actually experiment, randomize. And here's the thing, again, don't be a deterministic creature living in a probabilistic world. Experimenting once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times, and just saying, I've learned what's going on, I would be very skeptical of that. I make the mistake as well, right? But here's the thing. When we run randomized experiments, right? For example, when you're sleeping and you wake up, A is put on a meditation from the app Happier for 15 minutes. B is just lie in bed. C is get up and go and sit on a chair, right? Now you might try A, put on Happier for 50 minutes, 2, 3, 4 times, and it doesn't work, so you stop, right? Now, why is that a problem? Well, I can tell you, what you just did to impact your life and your happiness would never pass peer review if I reviewed your paper, and I think if most of my colleagues did. Because the randomized comparisons, ABC, in a probabilistic world that we know we live in, would have to have a much higher sample size. It might be 200 observations in A, 200B, 200C. Maybe it's actually even 1,000, right? Even if it's 50 or 10, 10 is probably even too small. And so the idea is that keep experimenting, keep randomizing. Even when you think you might have the best solution, again, don't be a deterministic creature, right? Keep experimenting every now and then. Even if you think A is best, every now and then throw in a B or C and see what happens. This is very hard to do. Again, this is what I do for a living. This is what I love doing. This is my passion. And I don't do it all the time. So you can Google one final article. Sendil, Malinthanan, New York Times, why it's so hard to experiment. Sendhil, and here I'll misspell it, but Google will clean it up for you. Multhainen, New York Times. why it's so hard to experiment. We often don't experiment in places where it's very cheap to do so, and it's very reversible, and there are a lot of benefits. So give it a try. So that was a lot for early in the morning. What do you all find interesting about this? What if you tell someone else is something you learned from this? If you were to message a friend or a colleague, who do you think you would want to get a link to this? And would want to see something like, thought you might like this. It discussed X. What's X? Is X, it talks about making better decisions by thinking probabilistically versus deterministically. Is X, it talked a bit about how to make decisions when you are trying to decide to go back to sleep or not. Is X, it mentions some interesting people to Google to learn about experimentation and applying science to everyday life. Is X, hey, this really strange person was just walking around in a circle and I thought you might like the scenery. So you tell me, I'll give you 30 seconds. What do you all find interesting about this? And what's your X? This was interesting because X. This was useful because X. One thing I'm going to do differently after this is X. If I share this with someone else and try and give some knowledge that could be useful to them, or at least entertain them, I would tell them, I thought you'd like this, I thought of you, and that you might like this because of X. Ten more seconds. 10 more seconds. Now, for those who stuck around, you can keep thinking or think of who you're going to share this with, and I'll give you a little dopamine for sticking around. Entertaining story, although you might not find it entertaining. Looking up at the moon, right? One of my nephews, actually the first baby nephew, or the first nephew within my mother's and her twin sister's family, Malcolm, I remember holding him, right? And he used to look at me and be like, moon, moon. I thought of him just now. I used to apply some developmental psychology, kind of based on that book, Causal Modeling by Alison Gopnik and Laura Schultz. I used to be like, Malcolm, what is that? You say, moon. What's that, Malcolm? Moon. Am I looking at the moon? Yes. Wow, Malcolm, I'm looking at the moon. And he'd get really excited. And this is a really fun exercise. And I think it's interesting because I read some research, can't remember which book it was in, about why Blue's Clues, and I think Sesame Street, are so effective. And it's because they do randomized experiments with what's called you can Google this, looking time study. One of the key tools for developmental psychology to figuring out how children actually think. I think kind of pioneered by people like Elizabeth Spelke, S-B-L-K-E at Harvard, and I'm sure others. I might not be quoting that accurately. Looking time studies and so on. And Sesame Street and Blue Clues actually are kind of strange or almost painful for parents to watch. I think especially Blue's Clues. They ask a question, they stop painfully long, and the parents are like, oh my gosh. They ask the same question many times. But you know why they do it? Because they've experimentally investigated, or they've extrapolated from studies, that is what actually engages children. Because children's brains are different from yours. They're thinking differently. They want more. What seems like repetition to you, to them is actually quite a novel experience. What seems like very slow, painfully slow to you, is actually just the right time for many of them. And so that's why I practice kind of repeating technique. Because I see when I do it, right, around some of my friends' children or colleagues' children, I feel weird doing it because I'm like, this seems weird, it's outside the norm, and it's like a really big repetition. But then, like, my colleagues who are developmental psychologists, right, are much more approving. They're like, oh yeah, good idea, Joseph. Whereas other people are like, oh, that's unusual. So you can decide, which one you want to try. The strategies that are within the norm, that 95% of people do, or the strategies that, the 5% who have the most knowledge about developmental psychology might endorse. What do you take away from that? If you tell someone else, oh, that last part of the video, here's a little link. Thought you might find it interesting because of X. What is that X for you? Because when you reflect like this, that actually helps you internalize the knowledge. Teaching someone else is one of the best ways to learn. I think I published like 20 or 30 papers on that. I can tell you about 1,200 more. So imagine telling someone else, here's one thing you could do differently as a result of what Joseph just said at the end of that video. You did A before, but try B instead. A, you just ask the child and taught them like an adult, ask them once, twice. Versus B, you ask them the same question in different ways. You act like you're discovering it just like they are. So what's that X? What's one thing you could do differently as a result of this? 10 seconds, because I'm tired. Maybe I'll get back into bed after this. Also, holding up a phone for 60 minutes takes a lot of energy. Whew, I can now work out. So what do you tell someone else? Something interesting you learned from this and you want to apply? Or what's one thing you could do differently after what I just said or anything you saw in this video? Anything inspired you to think of? You have a great day.